Hey guys, Freddy here. Welcome back to another Satanic Panic video. And this time I would like to present this.
This is CBC.
Good evening. Tonight we begin with a story about make-believe adventure and real-life violence, and what some critics fear is a connection between the two in a game called Dungeons and Dragons.
So, this is a piece called Is Dungeons & Dragons Dangerous? From CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Company, in 1985. Now, this is a bit more insidious than the other ones we've seen. The American videos we've looked at have been very much overblown, coming down on the side that Dungeons & Dragons is evil, role-playing games lead to Satanism, etc., etc. And the British one was more in favour of, well, this is a corporate business, it's making money, we should leave it alone. But this one tries to appear balanced, but really isn't. It's as biased as the American ones we've seen.
Millions of children and teenagers now play Dungeons and Dragons. They are drawn to the adventure, fantasy, and suspense the game creates through mythical characters and complex situations.
And even with a very short introduction, we're getting straight into bias. They're using loaded language here. You know, these are complex situations. This is a strange game. It's going to be confusing and children probably shouldn't be playing it. They're going straight in with that bias.
But increasingly, parents and psychiatrists are warning that the game is taking some children too far into the realm of dark and violent fantasy. They wonder whether for some children, Dungeons and Dragons becomes more than just a game. Carol Jerome prepared this report.
And why did we need two presenters to get us here? We had one guy who did a short introduction, we've now had a woman who did an introduction, and now we're going over to the report. Did CBC have too many presenters and they just need to give them something to do? Why so many people? But anyway, we're getting onto the meat of the report, and hopefully we're going to actually get some evidence, because so far they've said people suspect this, people think this. We're offered no evidence yet at all.
Okay, you enter a very small room, and there's a large black coffin right in the center.
Now, it might just be me, and it's probably unfair of the poor guy who's doing the games mastering here, because he's not a presenter, he's not trained to appear on character. But this reminds me of the Dead Alewives sketch about Dungeons & Dragons, where they magic missile the darkness. It's an old sketch, but the games master in that had such a monotone voice, I can't help but think they were mimicking this report.
The gate's shut behind you, slamming.
It looks like a few boys around a table, but in their minds, they're fantastical characters in another world, a darker world. Ole is a cavalier. Erwin is a paladin.
Hey, this report has a special effects budget. They've got people racing around on horses in full costume. This is higher budget and higher production values than I saw in a lot of things promoting Dungeons & Dragons at the time, especially the old TSR adverts. Why are they doing this? Are these clips out of a movie? I'm intrigued. I want to know more.
Dennis is a ranger.
Near the gates of Barovia.
Mikey is an illusionist. And Bill is a magic user. Nicholas is a fighter, and his little brother Matthew is a thief. In today's adventure, Mike the Dungeon Master leads them to a castle where they are attacked by wolves in the woods.
Now this is where I've got to give full credit to this Dungeon Master. Fantastic job in putting the players up against wolves. Because in so many of these clips where they show a sample of a game where they're trying to scare people about it, they'll have them fighting people, killing people. It'll be a game about murder. But in this, they're just some heroes, and they're fighting off evil wolves which are trying to attack them. That's a very positive spin to put on it. Full credit to the Dungeon Master for doing this. He's really helping protect the game at this point.
What are you guys gonna do?
I'm gonna draw my sword and use my second attack instead of attacking.
What do you do?
Together, they meet each challenge set by the Dungeon Master according to their character, which can be good or evil. They have magic weapons and spells to use to battle men and half-humans and monsters.
And again with the emphasis on the negative. They could be good or evil. They stress the evil part. And also a very peculiar choice of words, that they fight monsters or half-humans. While you do get the demi-human races, you get half-orcs, half-elves, etc. in Dungeons & Dragons, why pick them out specifically that people will fight them? Why not say that they will fight people, they will kill humans in their battles?
And each has an elaborate scoring sheet for his character, with points for wisdom and strength and the like. A throw of these special dice decide the outcome of battles in an intricate scoring system. Nothing is acted out. The real action is in the mind.
And they're using very much othering language here. They're special dice, they're intricate rules and character sheets. It's all confusing and strange, and you want to fear the strange.
Now you guys are entering the castle. So you have basically the doors are open to the castle. Sort of somebody taunting your mind saying, come and get me. Suddenly 5 zombies come up, grabbing your leg. What are you gonna do?
I like to hit him with my sword +3.
Okay, you roll the dice. Okay, you do sufficient damage and you cut off its arm, you dismember it. But you notice that the arm that you cut off is still hanging onto your leg.
And again, credit to the Dungeon Master. They're fighting zombies. These are horrible, weird things coming up from the ground, the undead that should be defeated. And one of them, even when you hack it apart, its hand is still grabbing onto you. It's creating clear monsters for the heroes to fight. There's nothing evil here. These are heroic actions. Again, credit to this Dungeon Master. He's doing a far better job than most we see in these Satanic Panic videos.
It's not as simple as old-fashioned cowboys and Indians. The goal here is to survive each adventure and gain points for killing enemy humans and monsters, and gather treasure along the way. But this medieval fantasy world is so detailed, so real, that some say it has caused kids to kill in the real world.
And there it goes. They're trying to twist it. You kill other humans for treasure, is what they dropped in there. Whereas the Dungeon Master's done a fantastic job giving wolves and zombies, you know, undead creatures clawing themselves out of the ground, wolves attacking the heroes, making it out that these are heroic actions. The commentators saying, you're attacking other people to steal their treasure. They're putting the evil spin on it.
Since these games are so violence-oriented, you do not just play at the game, you become the game. You are the game.
And it's Patricia Pulling, everyone. We recognise her from previous videos. Sadly, her son died, as we'll find out in a second, but she appears in these videos again and again speaking out against Dungeons & Dragons. While at the time I thought she was the main voice, I didn't realise she's pretty much the only voice speaking out against it. She was the figurehead of Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons, and the person that everybody went to interview.
Pat Pulling's son Bink shot himself in the heart 3 years ago, hours after a suicide curse was put on his character as he played D&D, as the game is called. Notes he left linked his suicide to the game. Pat Pulling formed a group called BAD, Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons. Along with the National Coalition of Television Violence in the States, BAD documents 28 cases of juvenile murder and suicide they claim are linked to D&D.
Now, they claim they've got 27 cases against Dungeons & Dragons, which, if we look at the figures, the millions of people playing, is an absolutely insignificant figure. Totally well within any margin of error. And the fact that many more should be committing suicide out of such a large sample size, just going by averages, shows that they've got no evidence at all. But the thing that stood out to me there was the fact that the television violence awareness people were interested as well. Because we had a big movement of that in the UK. A woman called Mary Whitehouse stood out against violence on television. And from everything I can see, she never spoke about Dungeons & Dragons. So that was a big difference between the UK and the US. That people talking about violence on TV were talking about Dungeons & Dragons as well, but apparently not in the UK.
They say it's the general violence and playing with evil characters, suicide curses, and pretend human sacrifice in the game that trigger the tragedies. Ironically, the publicity about one of these cases in 1979 made sales skyrocket.
And they bring up the case of James Dallas Egbert III, but without naming him, because by 1985 his case had been completely debunked as any connection to Dungeons & Dragons. When he'd been found, he admitted it was nothing to do with it. It was down to the pressure he'd been receiving because he was very young and at university. And his later sad suicide was nothing to do with Dungeons & Dragons because he hadn't even played since before his earlier disappearance. So they were completely disconnected, and everybody knew it at this time. But CBC gets to use it and lay out that there's evidence here, but they don't name it because they know they're in the wrong. Also, I have to point out the things that they're bringing up. You can play good or evil characters, that there's human sacrifice, etc. in Dungeons & Dragons. These are things I don't really recognise, because Well, first of all, I've never played an evil character in my time. I think it's very self-destructive. If you're out for yourself, you're going to be tearing against the party, and this is a cooperative game. So, evil characters don't really work in my mind. But your mileage may vary, and it's an option there. The game gives you the option. And that's the bad thing in the presenters, that you could be evil if you wanted.
It has been linked in suicide notes, police reports, and coroner's reports. There have been recently a couple of accidental killings, one in particular related to the game where the boy thought he was a god. Therefore, he begged his brother to shoot him to prove that he was deified. And in fact, of course, the boy died.
And again, they bring up cases without naming them, so it's difficult to research these things. But I have to say that if somebody thought they were a god and asked a friend to shoot them, that sounds more like a mental health problem than a Dungeons & Dragons problem to me.
I feel they're overreacting a lot. Like, I don't think that this game promotes death or anything. Not the way we play it anyway.
You know, I can tell the difference between reality and fantasy. Just about everyone I play with can.
Sure, there's bloodshed and everything, but I think it's better to shed it in the game than out in real life.
And once again, this guy's doing a brilliant job of defending Dungeons & Dragons. Get better to get the stress out in the game than outside of it. An escape valve, release the pressure. You know, these are psychological things which are shown to help deal with stress, having somewhere to get rid of it. Whether it's on a football field, whether it's from shooting people in the face in a 3D shooter, or whether it's playing Dungeons & Dragons. Get that stress out before it does you harm.
My adopted daughter, the fair Irina, has been these past nights bitten by a creature called...
The game's public relations man says the children in the murders and suicides, including Patricia Pulling, had other emotional problems already, and notes other elements like the presence of guns in the home.
Now, I'm very British in my point of view, so the fact that somebody keeps a gun in their house, and then when somebody uses that gun to commit suicide, the blame gets put onto another point of view, rather than the fact that there was a gun available for them to commit suicide with, seems very odd. But I'll accept there are other points of view, and I might very well be in the wrong. But the other points brought up are very, very strong. The fact that every time we look into one of these cases, there's always other things which could go towards somebody doing bad things or committing suicide. There's always other pressures. It's never just down to everything is perfect in their life and they play Dungeons & Dragons and then something bad happens. There's always other pressures and they're playing Dungeons & Dragons. It's not just the one thing. And we see these things having a bad effect on other people's lives, the stresses and strains of modern life.
There has been 0 deaths as the cause of Dungeons & Dragons. The game is played by some 3 to 4 to almost 5 million people now in Canada, in the United States, throughout the world. In fact, 15 other countries. And the game is built around cooperation.
Now, although rather understated, I think he makes a wonderful point there. On no court case ever has Dungeons & Dragons been down as the cause of a crime. Nobody has done anything bad just because of Dungeons & Dragons. It's always been other reasons.
Come on, everybody!
The Dungeons & Dragons ride!
Started in 1973 on a $1,000 loan, D&D now earns $30 million a year for its Wisconsin manufacturer TSR, with spin-offs like this television cartoon series.
And Canada, like America, very much going after TSR's making a lot of money, so that's a bad thing. How come they never do this about prosperity gospel and preachers, the amount of millions that roll into churches, that's a bad thing? No, it's just when it's Dungeons & Dragons making a lot of money, it's profiting off the things that it's doing to your children. Isn't this bad?
There is no escape from the realm of Dungeons and Dragons.
Few girls play it, it's mainly teenage boys, and they can spend hundreds of dollars on it in stores like Rigby's in Toronto, on monthly magazines, pocketbooks, guidebooks to over 40 different fantasy adventures, and miniature figurines.
And it picks on the fact that the audience for Dungeons & Dragons is mostly male. But then again, the audience for football is mostly male. Are those connected? Are those bad things? And also, once again, going on, these people are spending lots of money. Isn't this a bad thing?
And if they like, there are D&D video games too.
Congratulations, all you have done for next time. Or maybe it's just an
What the hell are they doing putting the soundtrack of Gorf over the top of Dragon's Lair? Now, Dragon's Lair itself is nothing to do with Dungeons & Dragons. It's more based on Hollywood, and that's where Don Bluth, the creator of the game, came from. Done a number of brilliant animated movies across his career. But the soundtrack of Gorf, while groundbreaking in its time with speech synthesis, is nothing compared to the Laserdisc-produced soundtrack and audio of Dragon's Lair. They're just ruining it.
At least 3 government studies in the States confirm a cause and effect relationship between consumption of violent entertainment and increased aggression. Police are also concerned about D&D, but they say they cannot make a conclusive judgment about its role in many of the murders and suicides.
Whoa, 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 whoa. I caught that. You said 3 reports on violence in media, not Dungeons & Dragons. When it says media, they mean films and television. Television you're part of, Mrs. Reporter. Now, you're being accused of infecting people through violence in your media. Dungeons & Dragons, there's no reports to say it's done anything. And while police are suspicious of it, mainly because they're receiving booklets from Pat Pulling telling them to be suspicious of it, it turns out, there's nothing to say that these things are connected at all.
One of the most perplexing cases happened here in St. Louis, Missouri. Last April, an 18-year-old art student named Mary Towie was killed by 2 friends, Ron Adcox and Darren Moler. All 3 played Dungeons & Dragons together, Darren intensively, up to 16 hours a day, sometimes sitting up all night with his character sheet.
So all 3 of them played Dungeons & Dragons. If Dungeons & Dragons affects people, why didn't she murder them? Why didn't the 3 of them go out and murder if it's having this effect? Why did it just have an effect on the 2 guys?
In his confession to the FBI, Darren included his alias, Demon Sammy Sager, his D&D fighter-assassin name. Darren told police they were fooling around drinking at Mary's house while her parents were away, getting ready for a Friday 13th party, and tied her up to mess with her mind, then put a knotted elastic bandage around her throat and went upstairs to have a couple of beers.
Okay, none of this sounds Dungeons & Dragons related. It sounds more horror related to me. Not one to blame at one of my favourite genres of movies, but it doesn't seem connected to Dungeons & Dragons at all.
When they checked again, Mary was dead, the blood to her brain cut off by the bandage. Darren and Ron then stole valuables from the house, dumped Mary's body in this woods, and fled in her car. When they were caught, they were each wearing one of her earrings.
And again, this sounds like typical trying to cover up their crime. This doesn't sound like a Dungeons & Dragons thing. In Dungeons & Dragons, you don't kill a monster and then hide the body. You tend to kill the monster, loot it, and then just move on. This sounds like a typical crime, nothing to do with Dungeons & Dragons to me.
The point is Darren Moler a cold-blooded killer, or did Demon Sammy Sager take over or change him? Darren's trial was first.
Ignoring the irony that a case involving a Friday the 13th party is being judged by Judge Voorhees, you're asking if the accused was being controlled by a character within him, which sounds a lot like possession to me. And I'd like proof that possession can actually occur before we even consider it in this case.
The defense lawyer maintains that the game was a major factor in determining Darren's behavior, and he is asking for the lesser charge of manslaughter. The prosecution holds that the game has nothing to do with Darren's actions and is asking for the death penalty.
And once again, like we've seen so many times before, a defendant is trying to use Dungeons & Dragons to get themselves a lighter sentence. It was the game, it wasn't me, I was under its control. And that's just a standard defense. Everybody tries to put the blame onto something else rather than themselves to get themselves a lesser sentence. It's just the way that the justice system works.
Pat Pulling was here to testify. She and a defense psychiatrist say there are elements here that echo D&D patterns.
And the psychiatrist that they so skillfully avoid mentioning was Dr. Thomas Radecki, who I mentioned before was disbarred from practicing psychology later on due to the fact that he was trading sexual favours for drugs.
First, the idea itself that tying someone up is a game. The Friday 13th motif, part of the superstitious magic of D&D. The messing with her mind, the robbery like plunder, the running for survival, the earrings like treasure.
Does it not strike anybody else that those links to Dungeons & Dragons are extremely tenuous? Those things, in my experience, really aren't part of the game. When has Friday the 13th come up in Dungeons & Dragons? They tend to even use different days of the week and different months in most fantasy worlds.
But no testimony about the game, including Pat Pulling's, was allowed by the judge. And Darren's lawyer, Lee Patton, was angry at that, saying the court preferred an open and shut case.
So what you're saying is that their evidence was not counted in court, so it's totally irrelevant.
In the absence of Dungeons & Dragons, in the absence of the desensitization to violence, I think he probably would have called the police or taken some other action rather than robbing and running.
Wait a second. So your defense is he wouldn't have tried to cover it up if it wasn't for Dungeons & Dragons. He'd have still committed the murder. That doesn't sound like much of a defense at all, I'm afraid.
Darren told Lee Patton, Demon has never died, and Patton is not sure just what that means. Darren's parents don't know much about it, but they feel the game is partly to blame, and they say Darren was worried that being Demon might have affected him.
And the parents trying to defend their kid. This is a very common reaction, and I think almost all of us would do it. Rather than imagine that our kid could do such a horrible thing, blame it on something else. It's the rock and roll music, it's the Dungeons & Dragons, it's the horrible movies, it's the religious cult that they joined. It's anything but their responsibility. Something else made my innocent little child do this.
And he'd sign everything, his papers, while he was going to school, as Demon Molitor.
The prosecution is denying the testimony on the game.
I heard.
Do you think that's important that it be admitted?
Yes, I do. I feel it'll turn the whole thing around. On Darren's behalf.
I feel that it'll turn the whole thing around, that if we can blame it on Dungeons & Dragons, my kid won't get executed for his crime. I go with that as well. I would use that defence. I would throw anything to try and save my kid's life. But that's not evidence of anything. That's just a very protective parent.
The victim's parents feel differently.
Our own thoughts have always been that Dungeons and Dragons was totally irrelevant to the entire case, that this was a case strictly of robbery and homicide and nothing else. These were two people who wanted money in a car and were willing to do just about anything to get it, and did.
Now, while it's easy to look at these as the vengeful parents of a murdered girl out to get the perpetrators sentenced to the maximum extent of the law, we can also look at them as the parents of a Dungeons & Dragons player, because their daughter also played D&D. And they saw there were no adverse effects. They understand that Dungeons & Dragons doesn't change somebody's personality, especially not enough for them to commit murder. They are possibly the best parents to understand this situation that you could get, because their daughter was playing the game as well.
These police and FBI agents were struck by how coldly Darren talks about the killing, and tend to believe he is just plain guilty. The judge agreed and ruled that Dungeons & Dragons had nothing to do with the death of Mary Towie. The jury found Darren Molitor, alias Demon Sammy Sager, guilty of first-degree murder, a life sentence, but no death penalty.
And as it was said, he was found to have not had Dungeons & Dragons involved in his crimes at all, and was given a life sentence rather than death sentence. A life sentence which is now ended. In the Hungarian press of all places, I found a report dated in 2022 that he's now been released onto probation. And during his time in prison, he did actually write a very anti-Dungeons & Dragons piece, but it was based on biblical references. It was from a very Christian point of view, talking about how Dungeons & Dragons has witchcraft involved in it and various other things, and the Bible talks about them being an abomination which should not be trifled with. But it's not from the point of a player of Dungeons & Dragons, it's just all biblically based.
As you near the castle, two of the stone gargoyles come from above and swoop down trying to attack you.
The crucial point is, can a game create psychosis, or is someone like Darren Molitor an accident waiting to happen, with or without the game?
Now, while that might be quite an interesting question, whether people are influenced by Dungeons & Dragons or there is just some overlap, I think it's very clear that there's definitely some overlap. If, as they said in this, that there's 3 to 5 million people at the time playing Dungeons & Dragons, there's of course going to be some overlap between people who have psychological problems and that massive group who are playing Dungeons & Dragons.
Supporters of D&D suggest it might even keep psychosis under control, providing an outlet.
Now, I've used this kind of excuse myself before, but I don't think there's anything to it. The fact that there were 3 to 5 million people and a certain percentage has suicidal thoughts and acts on those, and far less than that was discovered amongst the player base of Dungeons & Dragons, shows that Dungeons & Dragons has a stabilizing effect and the suicide rate was lower. But I think probably the connections hadn't been found. I think you will probably find that Dungeons & Dragons players are actually dead level. But using the evidence they use against us, or used against us, it kind of shows that Dungeons & Dragons had a stabilizing effect. If they're going to use false figures, then why shouldn't we?
Can I give him a proper burial?
But the killings and suicides are extreme cases of the issue. Matthew here cried for days when his character died, and Bill's mother says at one point he got too involved.
The kid cried for days when his character died. Let's remember that when Take That broke up in the 1990s, that they had to set up a suicide awareness line because people were going to commit suicide over a band breaking up. Young people are heavily emotionally invested into things, including characters, that they feel bad about it. And I have to admit, there's been characters in novels, one especially who died at the end of a series of 5 novels, and I cried for a couple of hours because I was so upset over the death of this character. And that was in my early 20s. It really emotionally hit me. That's the kind of species we are. We're affected by emotional things we create connections to. And a character that you're playing is something you'll create a connection to.
I became concerned and I spoke to the dungeon master about his behavior in the club. And he did admit that my son seemed to be becoming the character, taking on characteristics of his character. And I felt the same way. And I asked that he not go to the game for a while. And he agreed.
You know what I call that? I call that being a good mother. She saw a problem with her son, she went and spoke to people about it, and they solved the problem. He stopped playing for a while he got over these emotional problems. That's fantastic parenting. And I cannot criticize that. We should all be more like her.
Here in Orangeville, another case raised the same questions. A 14-year-old boy, who cannot be named because he is a juvenile, strangled 2 young friends in this schoolyard. It was brought out in this Orangeville courtroom that the young defendant was deeply involved in playing Dungeons & Dragons, and was in fact a dungeon master. But his preoccupation with the game was not considered a determining factor in forming his behavior, only typical of it. He was judged to have an obsessive-compulsive mental disorder and was acquitted by reason of legal insanity. The boy will be under care in a psychiatric institution for as long as necessary.
And it's difficult to comment without knowing the details of the case. But there's 2 things which spring up to me. First of all, it was proven in a court of law that Dungeons & Dragons had nothing to do with this, that he had other things going on, which were the cause of his actions. And secondly, I'd like to question, how do you strangle 2 kids to death in a school playground without being noticed? That seems very under-monitored to me. I'm certain that even in the reckless years when I was in a school playground in the 70s and 80s, you couldn't have gotten away with a double murder without somebody noticing.
Meanwhile, the game goes on. D&D has been banned in some Canadian schools, but is used by others like this one in programs for gifted children. Some teachers feel this role-playing is valuable social interaction and say it even improves reading and mathematics skills and knowledge of mythology and history. Much depends on the dungeon master, the group leader who controls the scenario, putting in as much or as little blood and gore as he likes.
And a pretty good point. It's up to the dungeon master how much blood and gore goes in. Much like it's up to a movie writer how much goes into a movie, into an author how much goes into his book. Into any storyteller, they can increase the amount of blood and gore, violence, etc. in their story. And it's completely up to them. It's not down to the medium, it's up to the individual storyteller.
Here, Denny is the dungeon master.
Well, it gives you a great sense of control and power over other people. Because, you can determine what happens to the characters. And it's really kind of neat, the feeling of power you get from it.
Now, I feel like the kid's language skills aren't that great, because he is a young kid, let's be honest. But what I think he's really saying is power is actually attention. People are paying attention to him. People are hanging on every word. If he was a great actor, if he was a great storyteller, people will be hanging on his words. And that's the power he's feeling. He's feeling the attention of keeping people on hooks with his story. Now, if that's a bad thing, then being a good actor, being a good speaker, being a good storyteller are all bad things as well.
Does the game encourage or even create Denny's love of power, or is it a healthy outlet for it?
In the manual itself, you warn the kids not to get their characters mixed up with themselves.
It's not a warning. All it is saying is that you understand this is a game, and you're playing a character, and that's it.
And why is a warning like that in the book? Because stories like this exist. Pieces of reporting where they say that people can't differentiate between reality and fiction. So they put a warning in, and then you go and use it against them again.
Pat Pulling is suing TSR and the teachers who conducted the game in her son's school for $10 million. She wants research into the D&D phenomenon.
We would like to see these violent games, such as Dungeons and Dragons, taken out of toy stores and not pushed in school systems and remain for the adult population.
And some more Pat Pulling, giving her 30 seconds more to express how bad Dungeons & Dragons, how she wants it banned from schools, how she wants it banned from toy stores, how she wants $10 million. Whereas in Balance, you gave a whole 10 seconds earlier to the fact that, or to the idea that Dungeons & Dragons gives people an outlet, that they can get their stresses out and it has positive mental effects. 10 seconds, and you've spent endless time with Pat Pulling explaining how bad it is. This is nowhere near balanced reporting.
Well, I think the parents should get into the game to see how it is, and then they can start judging if they should let their child play or not. I only play here, and when I leave the store, I leave the game in the store. I go out into life.
And again, fantastic ideas from this young dungeon master, where he's suggesting that parents get involved, that you leave the game behind when you come out of it. I know that getting involved is a brilliant idea. I'm involved in my kids' games and their introductions to role-playing, but my sister, who has no experience with role-playing at all, wasn't interested in my hobby because she's a few years older than me, did play along with her husband in games with their kids when they got into Dungeons & Dragons, and got involved and had a load of fun doing it.
You guys bury the body properly?
Perhaps this is the crux of the matter, how we deal with the undeniable love of violence in our species. D&D has taken it a step beyond even TV and movies and books, into the inner mind. Millions enjoy that voyage, but we don't really know how many others find unsuspected dragons in their psychic dungeons.
Oh, she's so very proud of that one. Unsuspected dragons in their psychic dungeons. She's used the name of the game in her criticism of it, and she's very, very proud. But really, what she's saying is violence in media can affect people, and she suspects Dungeons & Dragons does something without any evidence, ignoring the fact that she's representing television, and television broadcasts violence into people's houses all the time. Now, I don't think that has any effect, but she's got to take some justification for her own media, rather than suspicions that somehow role-playing games are far worse.
How, then, do we deal with our demons?
As you're walking over the drawbridge, the old rotten wood gives way beneath your feet, and you fall 1,500 meters down. So you have died. I'm sorry, but that's life.
For the Journal, this is Carol Jerome in Toronto.
So that's how it ends, with the death of a player character. Perhaps not the best note to go out on, and I wish the Games Master had given them something more positive to go out on, but I guess the presenter wanted that. They wanted it to go out on doom and death, to focus on the negative aspects of the game. But I prefer to focus on our final question, which is, how do we deal with our personal demons? And for me, it's spending time with friends. It's playing a game. It's getting stress out in a relaxing way. It's focusing on something rather than all the ordinary things I need to deal with on an everyday basis. I'm guessing that's not the answer she was looking for. I guess she would prefer us to get rid of our stresses in a different way and to focus on these games being a negative thing. Now, this is perhaps the worst of these documentaries that I've looked through, because it makes a pretense of being equal. It makes a pretense of looking at the positive qualities of the game, even momentarily, but it so focuses on Pat Pulling's agenda that Dungeons & Dragons is bad. Like so many of the others, even though it's come out a couple of years later when the holes in everything she says has already been seen. But anyway, I think I've whittled on for quite long enough as usual, so thank you very much for watching. But as always, most of all, you look after yourselves, and I'll catch you later. Bye now.